So I became an undergraduate in 1995 at the University of the West of England. Fact fans will be pleased to hear that over the past 30 years or so, that was when HE was at its lowest unit of resource per head. Never did me any harm. And I remember something very vividly about the first term of being at UWE. I got my first piece of work back just before Christmas. And written at the bottom of that piece of work was a little note from the tutor that said, "Jim, if you spent more time in the library and less time behind the bar, you'd have done well." And I remember thinking, okay, that's interesting. This piece of work has been marked on the basis of his understanding of me rather than the work itself, or at least that's the danger. And I remember going to see the head of department, because I was that sort of chippy character, and I remember saying, "Is that okay?" And he said, "Well, it might be, it might not be, but you can't really challenge it." And I said, "What do you mean you can't challenge it?" And he said, "Well, academic judgment is sacrosanct." And I said, "It's what?" And he said, "It's sacrosanct." And I said, "Why?" And he wasn't able to answer the question. And I remember thinking, why is academic judgment sacrosanct? And then about 3 months later, when I started to become a course rep and find out exactly how academic judgment was done, which was lots of very tired, overworked lecturers marking work late at night. In other words, I found out what was in the sausages. I remember thinking, sacrosanct is not the word I would use. And I guess ever since then, one of the things I've been doing is asking those questions about why. Why is something sacrosanct? Why is that something that's accepted in HE? And I've made a kind of career of it. I've been working in students' unions and NUS now for 10, 15 years. I now find myself in Norwich, which as a chief executive of a students' union, which is kind of all at once a sort of Gordon Brittas, Malcolm Tucker, and kind of Alan Partridge all in one, which is quite terrifying. But it's a good career. It's a career where you get to combine running things responsibly, because you're the responsible one as a chief exec of a students' union, with causing bits of trouble in the greater good. You get to be cheeky, and I kind of like that. It suits me, and it strikes me that some more people ought to be like that in public life. It's also a career where you get to look and think about change, and change is in the air. It strikes me that the size of the state is being radically reduced around us, and society is changing, and higher education is changing, not perhaps as fast as we might have thought, largely because of a public accounting trick which seems to be unravelling in front of our eyes. HE hasn't been getting smaller, but it might in the next few years, and it strikes me that as well that students and students' unions are changing too. And in a way, in the wider world, everything is changing. Our science, our technology, our values, our demography, our environment, geography, our social structures, everything is changing. And in a way, it's all getting worse. Our environment is degrading. Our morals are in disarray. Family life is collapsing. Our culture is dumbing down. Politics is done by media soundbite. Our democracy is corrupted. War is always on the horizon, and globalisation means a gale of disorder. Welcome to Daily Mail Island. But in a way, things are all getting better too. People are living longer lives. Democracy is spread by the media and by the internet, whether people like it or not. Our world's more interconnected. Education is spreading. The position of women is improving somewhat by all the international indicators. And what's interesting about that is I think both things can be true. We tend to be privately quite optimistic about our lives, our families and so on, but then publicly we tend to be very pessimistic about the state of the world. And that sense of private optimism and public pessimism comes together in organisations and institutions, in places like companies and workplaces and indeed universities. And that means that organisations and institutions like universities are essential to how we come to understand the world, mixing that sense of private optimism with public pessimism. Now, it seems to me that the job of leaders in all of that is to try and do a little bit of challenging, to ask questions about those things that are thrown at us that are automatically pessimistic or optimistic. And that brings me to this. So, faced with all this change, it strikes me that we can either confront or retreat, and we can either be radical or reactionary. So, out in the kind of big global world, you might be a kind of reactionary retreater, which tends to be associated with being melancholic or very nostalgic. You might be a kind of reactionary retreater, which is all about being new age or downshifting, or which is a kind of another word for losing your job. You might be a kind of confronting reactionary. In the real world, people that's kind of associated with the rural protests or right-wing nationalism across Europe. And then again, you might be a kind of radical confronter. Anti-globalisation and student protests are kind of associated with that. But what happens if we were to translate this to institutional and organisational life? Well, you might be a radical retreater. You will hear people like this around the sector in institutions saying, look, as long as what I do doesn't change, I don't mind. Then again, you might be a reactionary retreater. Do you remember the olden days when things were so much better? I do, but they're gone. Then again, you might be a reactionary confronter, and not many of us get to do this as leaders in organisations where you get to go back to basics, slash and burn, start again. Only when the money runs out does that become a real option. And so it looks to me like the thing that we want to do is to be radical confronters, and this involves acting differently, creating space to experiment both for ourselves and for our people, and to galvanise support to do something different and to do it quickly. And this, it strikes me, is the right response to radical change. So how do we pull off radical confrontation like that? Because on the one hand, we want to be adaptive and nimble and agile and learn fast about the environment around us. But then on the other hand, we're in universities. Solid, traditional, safe, conservative. A sense of stability is what matters. And I think the way you challenge that mix is by challenging conventional wisdom, asking questions, asking why something that is passed on through the ages is the way it is. It strikes me that that's very difficult in HE these days, because on the one hand we're supposed to be competing and innovating and being different, but in truth what that's doing to lots of institutions is making them all look and sound the same in the race to be top of the league table. And so challenging conventional wisdom, I think, becomes even more important in that environment. All industries have them. The student union industry has it too. And I like to think of these things as sacred cows. Normally sacred cows we think of as kind of bovine mammals of numerous stomachs, but in organisations and institutions they're outmoded beliefs or assumptions or practices or policies or systems that inhibit change and prevent responsiveness. And nowhere is there a bigger field of cows than in higher education. So I'm going to go through 10 of these sacred cows that I think we ought to at least question, if not tip, and perhaps even slay. The first is academic judgment. I've talked about that at the start. The world did not fall in, the sky did not fall in when other countries allowed the questioning of academic judgment, and it strikes me that it ought to at least be possible to ask a question about whether the judgment that's been expressed on a piece of work is good enough. But there are others. Let me go through a few. Second, I think, is the degree classification system. Students up and down the country do not understand why it's taking us so long to come up with an alternative. We ought to ditch the old 2-1, 2-2 nonsense straight away. Another, my number 3, might be institutional autonomy. We believe and think that it's sacrosanct, but what do we mean by autonomy? When are we free? A senior university administrator a few weeks back tweeted that it was a disgrace that the Office for Fair Trading was telling universities that they couldn't withhold academic progression on the basis of library fines, on the basis of institutional autonomy. We don't want to be told what to do. Well, look, institutions are free. You're just not free to rip students off. My fourth would be independent complaints procedures in universities. Why don't they exist? They do in all sorts of other types of institution, and whilst the OIA does its best, it's inside institutions that we probably ought to have independent ombudspeople. Post-qualification admissions, is it really beyond the wit of all of us to develop a system where people get admitted to university based on the grades they got rather than those predicted? And then there's some others. Why do we keep saying that students aren't customers? Well, people say that students aren't customers because there isn't a physical product. I'm about to go on holiday to Bulgaria. There's no physical product there. People say that students aren't customers because universities can't roll over and do it all. Well, when I go to Bulgaria with Lund Poly, they're not going to roll over and do it all. And it strikes me that there are at least some settings where students are customers. We ought to tell them what they're going to get and then deliver it. The lecture, Why is the lecture still a thing? Everyone knows that lectures are a really bad way of teaching and learning, and yet they persist. One of the ultimate sacred cows that probably ought to be slayed rather than commodified. And then feedback and assessment. How? 4, 5, 6 years, 7 years into really bad stats in the National Student Survey on feedback and assessment, aren't institutions publishing a standard by which they will get work back to students and then publishing where they are against that statistic, like the rail companies have to do? It isn't good enough. No one understands why we can't pull it off as a sector. And then 2 other sacred cows. Why do we look at the class of applicants but not acceptances, completions, degree classifications or jobs? Why are we obsessed with applications rather than all the other things, it seems to me, that matter? And then finally, why does every governing body of universities in the entire land believe that its objective in the next 2 years is to go up the league tables between 2 and 5 places? I've worked it out. Statistically, it's not possible for every university to go up the league tables in the next few years. So those are some of my sacred cows that I think we ought to at least ask questions of. Yours might not be sector-wide, yours might not be institutional-wide, they might be departmental-wide or role-wide or even person-wide. They might be things that you were told in a handover or things that are received wisdom inside an academic or administrative department. But they're there, there are sacred cows around us, and they either need tipping or slaying. A few tips before I finish. Whenever someone says something, whenever someone says to me that something is very complex, I always argue that it's simple. Whenever someone argues to me that something is simple, I like to pretend it's complex. Either way, it strikes me that that's a very helpful way of going cow tipping. Watch out for these phrases. When people say, I don't mean to be rude, they're about to be rude. When people say they're to be absolutely clear, they're normally about to obfuscate. When people say for the avoidance of doubt, they're normally trying to spread it. And when someone says, correct me if I'm wrong, I take great joy in correcting them because they're often wrong. But perhaps more importantly, I just want to say this. I think leadership these days isn't about doing or arranging or directing. I think it's about asking questions and creating the conditions where people can do different things and respond radically and confrontationally to change in the way that I talked about earlier. You don't have to believe, but you do have to provoke to be a decent leader, particularly in HE these days. So good luck cow tipping or cow slaying. And finally, I'd just say this: don't be too smug or gleeful when you go cow slaying, because this is people's lives that you're messing with. Thank you.